In October 1962, the world came within hours of nuclear war. But the first person to know that Soviet missiles were sitting 90 miles off the coast of Florida wasn't a spy, a general, or a diplomat. It was a janitor in Brussels who couldn't tie a garbage bag properly. His name was Eduard Kovač, and he mopped floors at the International Press Center on Rue de la Loi, a gray concrete building that housed journalists from 17 countries. Edward was 53 years old, spoke broken French, and had survived 2 wars by keeping his head down and his opinions to himself. He worked the night shift 6 days a week, emptying wastebaskets and wiping down desks while the world's reporters slept off their deadlines. He was invisible. He preferred it that way. On the night of October 10th, 1962, Edward made a mistake. He overfilled a trash bag from the 3rd floor wire room, the place where teletype machines clattered out breaking news from Moscow, Washington, Havana, and London. The bag was heavy. He tied it quickly, slung it over his shoulder, and carried it down 3 flights of stairs to the alley behind the building. The knot slipped. Papers spilled across the wet cobblestones. Edward swore in check, dropped to his knees, and began stuffing the papers back into the bag. Most of it was the usual mess. Carbon copies, cigarette butts, sandwich wrappers, torn wire copy marked with editor's notes. But one sheet caught his eye. It was a transmission from Reuters, date-lined Havana, marked urgent, and stamped with a time code from earlier that evening. It had been crumpled and discarded, but the type was still legible. The message was short. A Cuban dock worker had been interviewed by a Brazilian journalist visiting Havana's port district. The dock worker described unusual activity at a military installation near San Cristobal. He mentioned large cylindrical objects on flatbed trucks, covered with tarps, moving at night under Soviet guard. He used the word "cohetes," which means rockets. The journalist had tried to file the story, but his editors in Rio killed it, calling it unverifiable rumor. The Reuters stringer in Havana had picked it up anyway and sent it to Brussels, where it was read, dismissed, and thrown away. Edward stared at the paper for a long time. He had been a young man in Prague when the Nazis came. He had watched his city fill with soldiers and tanks. He knew what it looked like when powerful people prepared for war. And now, alone in a dark alley in Belgium, he was holding a piece of paper that suggested the Soviets were putting missiles in Cuba. He folded the paper carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he finished tying the trash bag and went back inside to finish his shift. Eduard didn't know who to tell. He wasn't political. He had no connections. He avoided police, embassies, anyone who might ask questions about his past. But he also couldn't ignore what he'd read. For 2 days, he carried the paper in his pocket, reading it again and again until the creases wore soft and the ink began to smudge. On October 12th, Edward was mopping the lobby when a man in a gray suit walked in and asked for directions to the American press office upstairs. Edward didn't speak much English, but he recognized the accent. The man was American. Edward made a decision. He pulled the paper from his pocket, unfolded it, and handed it to the man without saying a word. The American looked confused. He glanced at the paper, then at Edward, then back at the paper. His expression changed. He asked Edward where he got it. Edward pointed at the trash can. The American folded the paper, put it in his briefcase, and walked quickly toward the stairs. The man's name was Michael Harrington, and he wasn't a journalist. He was a communications officer working under light cover at the U.S. Information Service office in Brussels, which was a polite name for a CIA outpost. Harrington's job was to monitor European press coverage of American policy and report anything unusual back to Langley. He spent most of his time reading newspapers and attending dull press conferences. He had never seen anything like the paper Edward handed him. Harrington didn't wait. He went upstairs, locked his office door, and sent an encrypted cable to CIA headquarters in Virginia. He included the text of the Reuters transmission, the date and time code, and a note explaining that the document had been retrieved from trash at the International Press Center by a cleaning worker. He marked it priority. At Langley, the cable landed on the desk of a junior analyst named Ruth Kellerman, who worked in the Soviet Affairs Division. Ruth had spent the last 6 weeks tracking reports of unusual Soviet shipping activity in the Caribbean. Most of it was inconclusive. Vague sightings, secondhand rumors, blurry photographs from U-2 reconnaissance flights that showed construction at military sites, but nothing definitive. The Reuters transmission wasn't proof of anything either, but it was specific. It mentioned a location. It described large cylindrical objects. It came from a dock worker, not a defector or a paid informant, which meant it wasn't part of any known disinformation campaign. Ruth pulled every file she had on San Cristobal. There wasn't much. The CIA had noted increased activity in the area, but it was categorized as possible surface-to-air missile sites, defensive installations meant to protect Cuba from American airstrikes. The U-2 flights hadn't focused on San Cristobal because analysts believed the real threat, if there was one, would be closer to Havana or along the northern coast. Ruth made a recommendation. She suggested that the next U-2 flight over Cuba should include a low-angle pass over San Cristobal, with high-resolution cameras focused on any large transportable equipment. She attached the Reuters transmission as supporting evidence. Her supervisor approved the request and forwarded it to the Air Force. On October 14, 1962, a U-2 spy plane took off from Edwards Air Force Base in California and flew south over the Gulf of Mexico. The pilot, Major Richard Heiser, followed a flight path that brought him over western Cuba just after dawn. His cameras captured hundreds of images. When the film was developed and analyzed later that day, it showed exactly what the dock worker in Havana had described. Medium-range ballistic missile sites under construction near San Cristobal, complete with launch pads, transport vehicles, and support equipment. The photographs were delivered to the White House on the morning of October 15th. President Kennedy convened his National Security Council. The Cuban Missile Crisis had begun. But the CIA didn't learn about the missiles because of satellites or informants or brilliant intelligence work. They learned about them because Eduard Kovač couldn't tie a trash bag properly and because he handed a crumpled piece of paper to a stranger in a lobby. What Eduard didn't know, and what no one at the CIA understood at the time, was that the Reuters transmission he found wasn't just a piece of discarded wire copy. It was part of a much larger story about how information moved during the Cold War. The International Press Center in Brussels was one of the busiest news hubs in Europe. Correspondents from the United States, Britain, France, West Germany, Italy, and a dozen other countries worked there, filing stories, sharing tips, and trading rumors. They also threw away an enormous amount of paper. Every night, Eduard collected hundreds of pages of discarded teletype transmissions, draft articles, interview notes, and internal memos. Most of it was useless, but some of it wasn't. Intelligence agencies on both sides of the Iron Curtain knew this. The Soviets ran an operation called Collection of Open Materials, which tasked low-level operatives with gathering newspapers, magazines, and any publicly available documents that might contain useful information. The CIA did the same thing, but more quietly. They called it media exploitation. The idea was simple. Reporters often learned things before governments did, and even when their editors killed a story, the information still existed somewhere, usually in a trash can. The KGB had been watching the International Press Center for years. They didn't have anyone inside the building, but they didn't need to. They had Eduard. Eduard wasn't a spy. He had never been recruited, never been trained, never been paid. But in 1957, a Soviet diplomat in Brussels had approached him at a cafe and asked if he would be willing to set aside any interesting documents he found while cleaning the press center. The diplomat didn't threaten him. He didn't offer money. He simply reminded Eduard that his daughter still lived in Prague, behind the Iron Curtain, and that it would be unfortunate if her exit visa application was delayed indefinitely. Eduard agreed. For 5 years, he quietly collected papers and passed them to a contact who met him once a week at a tram stop near his apartment. Most of what he handed over was harmless. Old sports scores, weather reports, fashion columns. But occasionally, he found something more significant. A draft of a diplomatic memo, a reporter's notes from a NATO briefing, a wire transmission that hadn't made it into print. The Reuters story about the dock worker in San Cristobal was supposed to be one of those papers. Eduard had set it aside on the night of October 10th, intending to pass it along at his next meeting. But when the trash bag ripped and the papers spilled, he panicked. He grabbed everything quickly, stuffing it back into the bag, and in his hurry, he forgot which papers he'd already separated. The Reuters transmission ended up back in his jacket pocket instead of in the pile he was supposed to deliver. 2 days later, when he handed it to Michael Harrington, he realized his mistake. He had just given American intelligence a piece of information that the Soviets didn't know he had. And worse, he had done it in full view of the lobby security camera. Eduard didn't sleep that night. He waited for his contact at the tram stop, rehearsing what he would say, but the man never showed up. He didn't show up the next week either. Eduard understood what that meant. The Soviets knew. They had reviewed the security footage from the press center, identified Harrington, and realized that Eduard had handed over a document that could compromise Soviet operations in Cuba. On October 18th, Eduard received a letter from Prague. His daughter's exit visa had been denied. No explanation was given. By then, the missile crisis was escalating. President Kennedy addressed the nation on October 22nd, revealing the existence of Soviet missiles in Cuba and announcing a naval blockade. The world held its breath. Newspapers ran hourly updates. Diplomats shuttled between Washington and Moscow. For 13 days, the United States and the Soviet Union stood on the edge of nuclear war. Eduard watched it all unfold from his apartment in Brussels. He saw the photographs from the U-2 flight, the same location the dock worker had mentioned. He saw Kennedy's advisors pointing at maps of San Cristobal. He knew with absolute certainty that he had played a role in this. A trash bag had ripped, a paper had fallen, and now the world was deciding whether to destroy itself. The crisis ended on October 28th, when Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba. The world exhaled. Life went back to normal. But Eduard's life didn't. In November, he was fired from his job at the press center. No reason was given. He found work at a textile factory, then lost that job too. His landlord evicted him. He moved to a smaller apartment in a rougher neighborhood. He wrote letters to his daughter in Prague, but they came back unopened. In 1964, the KGB declassified a small portion of their files on foreign operations as part of an internal review. One document, obtained years later by a German researcher, described a failed intelligence asset in Brussels who had demonstrated unreliability and compromised operational security. It didn't mention Eduard by name, but the dates matched. The description matched. It was him. The CIA, for its part, never acknowledged Eduard's role in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Michael Harrington wrote a brief memo noting that a cleaning worker at the International Press Center had provided a useful document, but the memo was buried in a file that wasn't declassified until 1992. Even then, it didn't include Eduard's name. He was referred to only as a local national employee with no known intelligence affiliation. Ruth Kellerman, the analyst who recommended the U-2 flight over San Cristobal, received a commendation for her work. She went on to a long career at the CIA, eventually rising to the position of Deputy Director of Analysis. In her retirement, she wrote a memoir about her time in the agency. She mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis extensively, crediting the U-2 pilots, the photo interpreters, and the intelligence officers who worked around the clock to assess the threat. She never mentioned the Reuters transmission. She never mentioned Eduard. Eduard lived in Brussels for another 32 years. He worked a series of odd jobs: dishwasher, night watchman, hospital porter. He never married. He never saw his daughter again. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and the Iron Curtain collapsed, he applied for a travel visa to Prague. It was approved. He bought a train ticket, packed a small suitcase, and died of a heart attack 2 days before his departure. He was 80 years old. His apartment was cleared by the landlord. Most of his belongings were thrown away. But among his things, the landlord found a small wooden box containing a single piece of paper, yellowed and creased, folded into quarters. It was the original Reuters transmission from October 10, 1962. Eduard had kept a copy. The landlord didn't know what it was. He threw it away. The story of how a janitor's ripped trash bag exposed the Cuban Missile Crisis before the CIA isn't found in history books. It isn't taught in intelligence training programs. It doesn't appear in the official timeline of the crisis. But it's real. The Cold War wasn't just fought by spies and soldiers. It was fought in alleys and lobbies and trash cans, by people who didn't choose to be part of it, but who found themselves holding pieces of history in their hands anyway. Eduard Kovač was one of those people. He made a mistake. He tried to fix it, and in doing so, he may have helped prevent a nuclear war, or maybe he just handed a piece of paper to a stranger because he didn't know what else to do. History doesn't record motives. It only records consequences. And the consequence of a ripped trash bag in Brussels on the night of October 10, 1962, was that the world learned about Soviet missiles in Cuba 4 days before the U-2 photographs confirmed it. 4 days doesn't sound like much, but in a crisis that lasted 13 days, 4 days was everything. The document that Eduard found wasn't the reason Kennedy blockaded Cuba. It wasn't the reason Khrushchev blinked. It wasn't the reason the missiles were removed. But it was the reason the CIA looked at San Cristobal in the first place. It was the reason the U-2 flight happened when it did. It was the reason the photographs were taken. And photographs, unlike rumors, can't be ignored. The Cold War was built on secrets. But secrets are fragile. They live in trash bags and wire transmissions and crumpled papers in janitors' pockets. They survive because someone decides, in a moment of exhaustion or confusion or fear, to do something small. And sometimes, that small thing changes everything. Eduard Kovač never knew how important he was. He died thinking he had failed. He had lost his job, his home, his daughter. He had spent 3 decades in exile from a life he might have lived. He believed, until the end, that the ripped trash bag was the worst mistake he ever made. He was wrong. It was the most important thing he ever did, and no one will ever know his name.